Hello wrestling fans. Welcome back to the $20 million Pro Wrestle Machine studio and welcome back to the show. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. October 27, 1997 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. A.J.W files bankruptcy. Randy Couture wins his first big upset. Extensive Monday Night War ratings analysis, and much more. By Observer staff. The 29-year-old All Japan women's wrestling promotion officially filed for bankruptcy on October 21 and held a press conference later that afternoon in their Tokyo offices. The bankruptcy documents filed listed the company as being 1.6 billion yen in debt, approximately $13.6 million, and they bounced some checks of late with the banks they were doing business with, canceling their line of credit. The news came just days after the company's traditional WrestleMarine Piad show on October 18 at the Yokohama Bunka Gym drew a poor crowd. It was announced as 2,350, but the real number was closer to 1,000 to 1,500, and canceling its planned biggest card of the year on November 2 at Tokyo Sumo Hall due to virtually no advance sales. The Sumo Hall cancellation was covered as a pretty major story in the Japanese press as tickets had been on sale for the show since August 31. The company was down to 13 wrestlers, most of whom hadn't gotten paid in several months. Exactly what this means was unclear at press time, whether the group would be able to continue its schedule, as at the press conference they indicated they would continue to try and keep the promotion going and run more than 200 house shows in 1998, but the feeling is strong that this really signals the end of the promotion. The A.J.W office, founded in 1968 by the four Matsunaga brothers, would be the third oldest continuing wrestling promotion in the world, trailing only the EMLL in Mexico, founded in the 1930s, and the World Wrestling Federation, which is a WWF name, dates back to 1963 but was founded as Capital Sports by Vince McMahon Sr. in the 50s. The group ran between 200 and 250 house shows per year and had occasional specials, which had been running monthly of late, on the Fuji network, the top network in Japan, but airing past midnight. Over the years the promotion, which from the early 70s to the present was generally considered the top women's wrestling promotion in the world, has had its ups and downs, with the ups for the most part built around young rock idol type headliners that would burn out quickly. By the late 70s the work rate among their best wrestlers was close to the level of the top men from the same era. During the 80s, with headliners like Jaguar Yokota, Chigusa Nagio, Linus Asuka, Devil Masami, and later Manami Toyota, Kyoko Inoue, and Akira Hokuto, it presented a quality of matches unsurpassed anywhere in the world. From a business standpoint, it peaked in the mid-80s behind the Crush Gals phenomenon, and then broke all of the Crush Gals attendance records during a big run of inter-promotional matches from 1992 to 1994. In recent years, due largely to the lack of new talent replenishing the promotion, the interest level has gone way down, and the parent corporation itself, largely due to real estate debts, has been in bad financial straits for a few years. Vitor Belfort, the reputed 20-year-old, as in some circles it's believed he's actually older than what he's claiming, Brazilian sensation that many pegged as the young, charismatic and scarily effective performer that would become the superstar that the Ultimate Fighting Championship would be built around for years to come, was derailed in brutal fashion by U.S. national Greco-Roman champion Randy Couture as just one of the feature events of the latest UFC pay-per-view on October 17 from Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. The win by Couture, generally regarded as a stunning upset, puts him in the title picture, earning a shot at UFC heavyweight champion Maurice Smith, who retained his title with a win over last week replacement David Tank Abbott in the main event, on the Ultimate Japan pay-per-view show on December 21 from the 17,000-seat Yokohama Arena. In both super fights, the Belfort vs. Couture and Smith vs. Abbott, it was conditioning more than skill or overall strength and toughness that was the deciding factor. Both matches went just past the 8 minutes mark, and in each case, the loser was totally out of gas and either being, or about to be, hammered unmercifully. Belfort took a terrible beating and was hospitalized for several hours after the show, likely as much from exhaustion as from the punishment Couture dished out. Abbott simply quit when he ran out of gas, again putting his future in UFC's in question. He attempted after the match to get his heat back by doing a F this and F that interview, saying that he didn't care about winning or losing, that he didn't train at all for the fight. The show itself, before a sellout crowd estimated at around 1,500 in the small Casino Magic tent, had to be considered above all as the night where American amateur wrestling stars once again took the spotlight over from the Brazilians. Not only was Belfort, who the feeling for most ahead of time would be able to hammer Couture early as he had all his 4 previous NHB opponents upset, but so was Carlson Gracie's stablemate Carlos Barreto, the 6'4", 253-pound Brazilian who came into the match undefeated with victories over top American wrestlers like Daniel Babish and Kevin Randleman. Barreto lost a very close fight, although the decision was unanimous, to David Beneteau in one of the most evenly fought and exciting matches in UFC history. Barreto, who didn't protest the decision after the match, said that he came into the fight overtrained and couldn't get his body to do anything he wanted it to. However, both Beneteau, like Abbott in the main event, came off of the biggest win of his NHB career with something of a negative aura since he refused to go out for his tournament championship match against Mark Kerr. Beneteau, who had a grueling 15 minutes first-round match with Barreto, hinted in his interview after the win that he wouldn't be coming out for his match with Kerr, who won his first-round match in just 22 seconds. Later in the show he officially stated he'd made the decision to leave on a positive note after his upset win, and not ruin the night, saying he thought even up he could beat Kerr but basically said the difference in energy expenditure in each's first-round match resulted in his decision. Instead, Kerr faced alternate Dwayne Cason, a natural light heavyweight wrestler who had to eat his way up to 205 to 210 pounds just to be a heavyweight, and Kerr won the third NHB tournament, 2 UFCs and another in Brazil, of his career with very little competition. Beneteau's decision was weird since he's probably done amateur wrestling for around 15 years and in that period must have done countless tournaments. I doubt if he'd ever withdrawn from a tournament without being injured simply because his opponent had an easier draw. While some gave him points for honesty in not making up an injury as a reason to withdraw, the truth nowadays in UFC always gets out because they do extensive post-fight medical examinations, and if there is no legitimate injury, the word would get out anyway, so lying would be of no benefit. In many ways, this pointed out the big problem nowadays with doing tournaments. Tournaments, which put the UFC on the map in its early days, may be passé now because the expected climactic matches for some reason, whether they be injuries or upsets, never take place no matter how tournaments are stacked. In addition, it is hard to get good quality fighters willing to risk their reputation in a tough tournament, so often easy matches are given in the first round, which defeats the very purpose of having a 4-man tournament. Even though the expected Kerr vs. Barreto battle of undefeated top 10 ranked fighters didn't occur in the tournament and Kerr breezed through, the show was considered by virtually everyone as one of the best UFCs in a long time, with the upsets, several evenly matched fights, and a competitive championship match with a weird finish. Abbott, who officially got the word on Tuesday afternoon, although he had gone on a television show in Los Angeles on Monday night when the word was out there was a very good chance Dan Severn was out and he talked about the match with Smith, managed to tag Smith with his trademark hard punch and mount and pound him, and did at one point have him in very legitimate trouble. However, like Mark Coleman before him, as the minutes went on, even though Abbott had Smith in the top position, it was Smith who was scoring more, generally elbows to the top of Abbott's head. Smith, who is by no means a submission expert, but has been training with Frank Shamrock on and off for a few years, tried a few arm submissions but Abbott was strong enough to get out of them. However, when ref John McCarthy stood them up due to lack of action with Abbott simply laying on Smith, it was evident that Abbott was done. He really didn't even want to come out of his corner, but was convinced to do so, took 2 hard whipping leg kicks, the second of which was quite brutal, and told McCarthy that he had enough. While the leg kicks were brutal, Ken Shamrock, who has fought both of them, has told people that Smith's leg kicks are a lot stronger than the more flashy-looking leg kicks of Boss Rutten, and he was totally out of gas. The simply quitting at that point did a number on his aura that he'd managed to manufacture about his toughness and fighting ability. It was the first time anyone in a UFC had ever quit a fight based simply on leg kicks, and in many ways it was a logical decision in that he had nothing left and staying out there was only going to result in a lot of punishment. However, his manufactured image was such that a tank Abbott wouldn't quit a fight. So after all UFC shows, the question is now, what happens next? The most important factor again is that there has been no movement from the cable industry, even though rule changes have been put in place largely to satisfy the people who have made UFC a sacrificial lamb. The show was available in around 15 million or so homes. For whatever reason, even though the lineup was more attractive and they were coming off a good show, based on our limited areas of response, we don't have an impression the show did as well on buys as the previous one. The reality is, until there is movement from cable, the short-term future of UFC is in jeopardy. Based on so many organizations worldwide and fighters who have built up names, largely through UFC, NHB will continue in some form, although political realities in the US seem to make it so Japan and Brazil may be the prime sites and not North America. The plan is for the December 21st show in Japan to be the biggest show of the year, because the idea is they'll have a big live gate to play with in Japan, with 2 tournaments and 2 or 3 super fights. The plan originally was to hold off Mark Coleman versus Vitor Belfort for that show, But we know that happened there. So then the dream match became Smith versus Belfort, and that isn't going to happen either. Belfort versus Kerr would make a great semi-final to a Smith versus Couture main event. However, putting Belfort against such a tough opponent, who at this point would be favored against him, would put him at risk of suffering a second straight devastating loss, and I'm sure there's the theory now to rebuild Belfort's image if possible rather than throw him in there with one of the biggest lions in the NHB jungle. Quite frankly, even with how impressive Couture came out of this show, there are a lot of questions about the marketability of that match both on American pay-per-view and in Japan. It's also going to be quite a difficult match for Smith, whose 4-0 record in NHB and World Championships in both EFC and UFC on paper make him undisputedly the #1 star in the sport, but the reality is his unbeaten record has been built on 3 wins against stronger men that ran out of gas and 1 win against an overmatched opponent. There had been serious talk of Kevin Jackson versus Frank Shamrock to crown an under 200 world champion, although with Shamrock having a November 29th match in Japan against Inshin Inoue on the Shudo Valley Tudo card in Tokyo, there is now the feeling that using the Shamrock Inoue winner, Inoue, the world heavyweight champion in Shudo, was also considered as a potential foe for Jackson, maybe a risk due to an injury just a few weeks before the fight. And the name Mario Bustamante, who defeated former UFC under 200 tournament champ Jerry Bullander recently in Brazil, has surfaced as another possible foe for Jackson. For Japan, names like Frank Shamrock, Kimo, Dan Severn, Boss Rutten and perhaps still Abbott would mean something, particularly as foreign draws against a top name from Japan, as they have already established their names in Japan, and because the early UFC shows did very well in Japanese video stores and received far more publicity both in pro wrestling and martial arts magazines, but the recent shows where guys like Couture have made their names haven't been nearly as well publicized. But without question, due to the somewhat unpredictable nature of what happens when top guys square off due to various ways styles match up, it appears now that building a match for months, like it's done in boxing and pro wrestling, may not be feasible. Coleman versus Belfort and Smith versus Belfort were both circumvented by upsets as well as injuries. Smith versus Severn didn't even wind up taking place. The other lesson that is becoming painfully obvious is that when it comes to the top level of competition, steroids, the big controversial subject, haven't appeared to have been a positive because they work against the stamina of the fighter, and it doesn't matter how fast, or strong, or skilled someone is. When they're out of gas, they're done. We've seen it before and we saw it again. Because of the various cable outlets not carrying the event, the show was also broadcast on the internet for $20. As a test market without a lot of publicity, it drew about 1,000 orders. If the internet can be viable as a distributor of the shows in the long run, it may mean survival of UFC even without a turnaround within the cable industry. But there is no guarantee of enough people willing to spend money to buy the signal through their computer or how long it'll take before such technology becomes viable to the masses. 1. Alex Chief Hunter 2-0 beat Harry Moskowitz 0-1 via a split decision after 12 minutes. Hunter was a 210-pound jiu-jitsu fighter and Moskowitz was a 243-pound freestyle wrestler. This was an even match with some feeling Moskowitz deserved the fight. 2. Dwayne Kaysen 1-0 beat Houston Door 0-1 when the referee stopped the match in 3:42 with Kaysen on top of Door throwing punches. Door is a 39-year-old kickboxer, while Kaysen, a nephew of Michael and Leon Spinks, is a freestyle wrestler billed at 215 pounds, but he may have been a little lighter, although for the most part the weights announced on this show for the first time ever in UFCs were real weights from legitimate weigh-ins. 3. In a heavyweight tournament match, Mark Kerr 6-0 beat Gregory Stott 0-1 in just 22 seconds after a knee to the face. 4. In the other heavyweight tournament first round match, David Beneteau 4-5 beat Carlau Barreto 7-1 via unanimous decision after a 12 minutes regulation and 3 minutes overtime. This was an evenly fought match and one of the better matches in UFC history. Both managed to at times control the other and put the other in dangerous situations. Beneteau, who has some boxing skill and still competes in amateur wrestling, was able to use his wrestling balance to avoid takedowns and his boxing ability to do damage up top. Both men were very tired after such a grueling match. Beneteau suffered a bloody nose late in regulation. Barreto went for leg kicks but was taken down at the end of regulation, and Beneteau controlled the top. Barreto was continually going for arm bars and triangle chokes but never could clamp them on. In the overtime, Beneteau was on top, but in Barreto's guard, for most of the 3 minutes. Actually, I had Barreto as the winner, but based on the response here, that would be a minority viewpoint, but all agreed it was a very close fight. 5. Randy Couture 3-0 beat Vitor Belfort 4-1. in 8:17 when the referees stopped the fight. Belfort weighed in a legit 224, or 19 pounds heavier than when he first arrived in UFC in February, and that was probably a major factor in him blowing up so fast. He actually pulled a stall before the match started, refusing to come out, which was said because he was so mad about Barreto, his stablemate, not getting the decision. Couture never backed up and would smother Belfort, so he couldn't throw his punches and lock up standing, where Couture's Greco-Roman background would come in handy, as he was able to tire Belfort out in the clinches. Belfort ripped Couture's shorts. Finally, Couture took Belfort down and got the side mount. It was amazing, whether it be due to exhaustion or just because Belfort's ground skill was highly overrated, but Belfort didn't show anything when they went to the ground. Couture went for a choke and Belfort got out of trouble. Couture threw several punches and knees while dominating him on the ground. When Belfort managed to escape and get to his feet, he was noticeably tired and they were trading punches, and Couture was shockingly winning the exchanges with a very talented boxer. Couture took Belfort down and was hammering him, and he was defenseless. Ref John McCarthy actually gave Belfort more of a chance to recover than he'd have given a less of a name performer. But Belfort wasn't responding and he had no choice but to stop the fight. 6. Kerr 7-0 beat Kaysen 1-1 in just 54 seconds by taking him down, throwing some punches, and choking him out when he turned. It was Kerr's second consecutive UFC tournament win, and his 3 tournament victories put him in a category with only Royce Gracie in modern NHB. Both were wrestlers, and Kerr weighed 253 and was a much higher class level wrestler than Kaysen, a 20-year-old who was a teenage champion that was outweighed by around 45 pounds. 7. Smith 4-0 beat Abbott 6-6 in 8-11. At the beginning, Smith was able to make Abbott look silly on his feet, throwing leg kicks and avoiding Abbott's lunging punches. Abbott backed Smith into the fence where they traded punches, and Abbott knocked Smith down and bulled him near the fence. Abbott had flurries of punches from the top before Smith got the guard. Abbott broke the guard and threw another flurry of punches. Smith went for some submissions from the bottom as Abbott tired, and threw a lot of elbows to the top of Abbott's head. Finally, McCarthy ordered a restart and Abbott was exhausted. After 2 hard leg kicks, Abbott told McCarthy he was quitting. After a disastrous first pay-per-view show, it was made official on October 20th that the International Wrestling Forum promotion has folded. The October 11th show, which was not well received, also drew one of the lowest buy rates in the history of any live event, doing in 0.03 buy rate, or around 9,000 buys nationwide. This coincides with the live event looking disastrous with 200 to 250 fans in the building. Break-even for a live event of this type would be in the 30,000 range. The Extreme Fighting Championships, run by the same John Peretti who organized IWF and fell victim to both red ink from money-losing pay-per-view shows as well as tremendous political opposition, debuted at 60,000 buys, and most of its follow-up shows were in the 30,000 to 40,000 range when it came to total buys. This event was not well promoted except in media that targeted amateur wrestling fans, even though it had a caliber of athletes superior to probably any combat pay-per-view in history. It also shows that the audience that follows amateur wrestling isn't either large enough or interested in trying something new enough to cater a pay-per-view show to. Pure submission wrestling is far too specialized an event for pay-per-view, which at this point still needs some degree of mass appeal, even to the cult degree of an ECW, to make a go of it. Quite frankly, NHB in general hasn't economically made it on pay-per-view with the exception of UFC, but any form of fighting on American pay-per-view that doesn't include punches to the face has never been successful after the first show. Rather than take the greedy route, which has proven to be unsuccessful in every instance except UFC, which is a total fluke, promoters attempting to start new sports of this type need to find free television outlets to expose their product for a long period of time and hopefully gain some sort of a following, and then create matchups to intrigue that audience and put them on pay-per-view, rather than the totally ass-backwards direction everyone takes with things like UWFI, Pancrase, IWF, and K1, all of which ultimately didn't make it on pay-per-view, because the promoters were trying to sell an event to a public that need education on what the event was, and without that education period, didn't even know or care about such an event to begin with. World Championship Wrestling once again broke its all-time gate record this past week, but the amazing thing is it's a show that is more than 1 month away. WCW puts tickets on sale for its November 23rd World War III at the Palace in Auburn Hills, Michigan, announcing nothing locally except a 60-man 3-ring battle royal and that WCW, the NWO, citing cruiserweights and high-flying Mexicans would appear, sending Larry Zbyszko and Bobby Heenan to do local promo work. By the end of the first day of ticket sales on October 17th, they had already sold 7,268 tickets for $247,671. The company all-time record house was set for the June 9th Nitro in Boston, which was $243,946. As of the end of business on October 20th, the Detroit totals were 9,153 tickets sold for $306,971, making it the first show in WCW history ever to break the $300,000 mark. In the 80s, Jim Crockett Promotions, which was the predecessor to today's WCW, did break the $300,000 mark on a few major occasions such as Starrcades in Greensboro and Atlanta. WCW will actually break the $300,000 barrier for the first time at the Halloween Havoc pay-per-view on October 26th in Las Vegas, as they are expecting a gate in the $315,000 to $325,000 range with 2,200 tickets still left unsold as of press time. One of the reasons these gate records are falling is because the ticket prices for WCW have been raised considerably as the live events, and in particular the Nitros and pay-per-view dates, have become so much more of an in-demand ticket. It's become a really weird psychology when it comes to wrestling fans, in that there is a huge demand for high-priced tickets in particularly the major markets, but lower-priced tickets are difficult to sell, and the frequent Monday sellouts have been done simply by raising ticket prices across the board. On the surface, it makes no sense, but it again proves that pro wrestling tickets are an impulse rather than a rational buy, and thus normal economic factors in regard to pricing don't apply. In building toward its third pay-per-view show, Extreme Championship Wrestling had two title changes over the past week. Bam Bam Bigelow captured the ECW heavyweight title on October 16th in Queens, New York from Shane Douglas, to set up a rematch on the November 30th pay-per-view show from Monaca, Pennsylvania, just outside of Douglas' home city of Pittsburgh. In addition, the tag team titles changed hands on October 18th in Philadelphia at the ECW Arena with the FBI, Tracy Smothers and Little Guido, winning the titles from New Jack and John Kronus. That title change sets up a four-way dance for the tag titles at the pay-per-view involving the aforementioned teams along with the Dudleys and Axl Rotten and Balls Mahoney. The only other match official for the pay-per-view will be a ladder match with Sabu vs. Sandman. Two other matches that are probable are Taz defending the TV title against Pitbull No. 2 and Tommy Dreamer vs. Rob Van Dam, although depending on several circumstances, it could be changed to Taz vs. Van Dam, which would leave them with Dreamer in a different position. The Douglas vs. Bigelow match will be part of a lengthy storyline involving the triple threat. The gimmick is that Rick Rude has been picking opponents for Douglas to toughen him up as champion. Rude's opponent for the Queen show was Bigelow. At this point, the other member of the triple threat, Chris Condito, along with Sonny and Francine, attempted to convince Bigelow not to take the match. Bigelow wouldn't listen, they did the match, and Bigelow won the title in 6:51 via pinfall. This sets up Rude once again feuding with Douglas, in whatever limited ECW appearances he'll be doing in between his WWF commitments, and takes Bigelow out of the triple threat. The storyline next will be that Lance Storm will attempt to join the triple threat, but that will be a long-time deal in which he's part of the group but not an official member. Douglas vs. Bigelow will headline the pay-per-view in a match where Douglas would be the total babyface since it's his hometown. Bigelow was the babyface for the New York title switch match, but the storyline will continue for several months after the pay-per-view match. The decision to go in this direction was probably made recently, as there had been several others under consideration to work with Douglas, including Jeff Jarrett, Cactus Jack, and at one point even Brian Pillman, who did a series of angles last year with Douglas, but due to his injury, they never actually did a match, although he was never under what would be called serious consideration. Paul Heyman was also attempting to negotiate getting one date on Ric Flair as a settlement with WCW in the much talked about but still not filed lawsuit ECW has talked about with WCW. But WCW hasn't even discussed serious negotiations for a settlement before actual filing. On the tag team scene, the title switch was presented as something of a fluke. Smothers and Guido basically sold the entire match for New Jack and Kronus, but won at the end due to outside interference by the Dudleys and through a bad decision by heel ref Jeff Jones. This sets up a four-way where the idea that will be promoted is that with such weak tag team champions going into a four-way, you're almost guaranteed a tag title switch, but you don't know which team will be the one to win. With the Monday Night Ratings war still being the hot topic of discussion and comparisons within the industry, at least in the United States, a secondary set of questions which hasn't been answered has come up. Who draws what ratings and why? Wrestlers have tried to talk about who individually draws what to prove who is over, and who isn't. Bookers have done the same, and management theoretically pores over the quarter hours trying to figure out what lesson exactly the viewing patterns of the public is telling them about which individual wrestlers. Like most of pro wrestling, lots of talk. Lots of figures quoted without understanding. Almost no research. With the start of the fall season at the beginning of September, we've been compiling all the quarter hours and who was in them in a key position. There are many ways you can do ratings for individuals, but the decision was made that the best is to judge based on how the ratings went up or down as compared with the previous quarter. Obviously, if there is a huge audience watching, getting a big rating for a quarter is easier than if you start out. The quarter-hour differences, pluses and minuses, tell if more people were tuning on than tuning out when this personality, and this is a personality-driven business, was the key part of the show. With any system, there are flaws. The two key ones right now are the 9 p.m. to 9:15 p.m. quarter hour on Nitro. With the start of the NFL and the start of Raw, you are almost guaranteed to drop at least a few rating points. The other key position is on Raw, during that unpredictable period somewhere between 10 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. when Nitro finally goes off the air. In theory, Raw should pick up viewers during that quarter, although as we've discussed, the reality is that isn't always the case. But in theory that should be a good period for Raw. Aside from that, this system is pretty well fair and foolproof. Wrestlers in the first quarter hour, since the show is just starting and there is no plus or minus to figure from, aren't figured into the equation, although the pattern right now for both shows has been to start the show with interviews with the biggest stars. And before getting into any more analysis, we'll just present the data as it exists. The only names listed are those who since the start of September have contributed to at least a 0.5 plus or minus rating. Wrestlers who aren't listed, and these are the majority, are basically ones that over the course of between September 1st and October 13th, the October 20th shows aren't included in these numbers, have really made no ratings difference. Just looking over the list, a very first impression is that for the most part, it shows that it isn't the personalities that draw the ratings, it's the television show itself, the promotion and the positioning. Keep that in mind not only when it comes to television ratings, but crowd reactions, and really every aspect of this business. However, and to what degree is more a matter of positioning than any sort of ability either in the ring or on the mic. If someone is put in the same group as the stars and positioned as a star, they become a star, even if they don't draw, flop in their role, or whatever. Once they are positioned to that point, most people to a degree, take it like they are on that level. This should weaken a lot of leverage of a lot of wrestlers when it comes to contract negotiations because of what they mean to the ratings, when in fact, as individuals, for the most part, the exception being the short-term boost when a guy like a Roddy Piper, or potentially an Ultimate Warrior that were major stars that disappear for a few months and come back, they mean very little. Bret Hart's numbers were negative. Shawn Michaels was only A+2. Hulk Hogan was A+4. Sting was a -1, although based on the last 6 months since WCW used to do that phenomenal final quarters, I'm sure his numbers would have been as impressive as anyone's up until the last month or two, and that probably does say something about how they've crossed the boundary of going too long with his angle to where it is beginning to erode in interest. And Scott Hall's numbers speak for themselves. Now to a point, based on a different type of positioning, he's done a lot of matches in the 9 p.m. quarter. Hall has simply been the wrong guy at the wrong time. Although the fact is that out of his 8 quarters where he has been the focal point, 6 of them saw the ratings drop from the previous quarter, and not all of them can be explained by simply being at the 9 p.m. quarter because some were in more advantageous time slots. And no matter where they've been placed in the show, the ratings have increased significantly every time Disco Inferno has done a match and every time but once that Roddy Piper has appeared on television on this run. The single most overlooked aspect of Raw versus Nitro is if you ask people on the street, so to speak. Raw seems more popular among the so-called hardcores and internet types, but those are also largely the teenage and early 20s males that don't make up the bulk of the television audience. Nitro's dominant position has from the start been because of attracting a new audience that hadn't been watching WWF wrestling on Monday nights, largely late 20s and older, which is where the bulk of the population fits. That audience grew up with Hulk Hogan, Roddy Piper, Randy Savage, Ric Flair and the rest, and no doubt that's a big part of it. But I can also say the main response when I've been to places where people ask me about wrestling and bring up the two shows, that 80% of the time people say they watch Nitro ahead of Raw, usually more out of habit than what is on either show. And the first reason they'll bring up is the most simple reason that nobody has been able to grasp, but I hear it every time. The wrestling on Raw is so slow, or its corollary, the wrestlers on Nitro are so much better. For all the desperation tactics Raw throws out, how many times it trots out Steve Austin, how many interviews Shawn Michaels does, its biggest weakness is the pace of its matches and its excitement level of those matches to the audience in comparison to its competition. And speaking of ratings, October 20th was another record setter for both WCW Nitro and pro wrestling in general. Nitro drew its largest audience ever for an opposed show, doing a 4.54, 4.65 first hour, 4.47 seconds hour rating and 6.98 share, breaking the competitive record of a 4.34 set for the August 4th Nitro from Auburn Hills, Michigan with the Hulk Hogan vs. Lex Luger main event. On August 25th and September 1st, with Raw preempted, Nitro both weeks drew a larger audience than this past week at 4.97 and 4.73 respectively, the former with no football competition, the latter against the NFL Monday season opener. Even more impressive is the record was set with competition during the second hour from Monday Night Football, even though the game drew only a 12.0 rating as opposed to the usual 15 to 16 level, which was probably a contributing factor in the Nitro record rating. In addition, the Nitro replay drew a near-record 2.24 rating. The record is 2.31 also set for the August 4th show, and 4.69 share, with Raw drawing a healthy 2.96, 2.88 first hour, 3.05 seconds hour, rating and 4.59 share. It means that the combined ratings for the 6 head-to-head segments was a 7.39 and 11.03 share, or a total audience watching both shows of 5,398,000 homes. This breaks the record combined audience at 7.11, which was an 11.86 share since fewer people are watching television as a whole on a Monday night in August as opposed to October, and 5,065,000 homes also set on August 4th. For October 13th, Nitro did a 3.77 rating, 3.83 first hour, 3.73 seconds hour, and 5.69 share to Raw's 2.26 rating, 2.05 first hour, 2.48 seconds hour, and 3.43 share. The Nitro replay did a 1.62 rating and 3.45 share. On October 20th, WCW had a strong first hour which peaked at a 5.0 for the segment, which included Steve McMichael vs. Mortis, a confrontation between Steve and Deborah McMichael, the Mexican feature by Mike Tenay on Rey Mysterio Jr., and a Raven interview. WCW also did a 5.0 in the fourth quarter hour featuring the Giant destroying Mexicans and the Juventud Guerrera vs. Yuji Nagata match, although the audience was slightly lower than the previous segment. The second hour remained strong until the Scott Hall vs. Scott Steiner match, which saw the numbers drop from a 4.8 to a 4.3, and then down to a 4.1. So for whatever reason, the numbers dropped significantly again with Hall and the Steiners despite being put in the main event position in what should be the highest rated segment of at least the second hour, particularly since from the very start of the show they were building to a big finish, and it was made clear the entire show that all the big stars would have a schmazz at the end. Raw stayed rather steady, again only getting a tiny pickup, 2.9 to 3.2, when Nitro went off the air. For the head-to-head segments, WCW opened with a 4.7, Disco vs. Mysterio plus Hogan/Savage/Bischoff interview, to WWF's 2.7, Shamrock and Johnson vs. Kama and Maivia. WCW did a 4.3, Hennig vs. Malenko, to WWF's 3.1, Brett vs. Farouk. WCW did a 4.6, Norton vs. Trailer and post-match Trailer Destruction, to WWF's 2.8, Jarrett Shoot-style interview. WCW did a 4.8, Luger vs. Booker T, to WWF's 2.9, Mero vs. Christopher. WCW did a 4.3, beginning of Hall vs. Scott Steiner, to WWF's 3.1, beginning of Owen vs. Michaels, and finally WCW did a 4.1, Hall-Steiner conclusion and post-match with Piper, Sting, Page, and NWO, to WWF's 2.9, Owen vs. Michaels conclusion, Undertaker interview, Kane/Dude Love confrontation. In a counter-programming move, the USA Network and WWF have scheduled a Survivor Series flashback show on October 28th, airing both at 8 p.m. and again at 11 p.m. Eastern Time, the same two starting times as the TNT-produced Escape from Devil's Island premiere movie starring Hulk Hogan and Carl Weathers. The flashback show is being heavily pushed as the night of 100 stars, including Hogan, Savage, Flair, Hennig, Diesel, Razor, and other WCW names featured prominently in the ad, which will be headlined by a match from November 28, 1991, where Undertaker pinned Hogan to win the WWF title. WWF drew a tremendous 3.8 rating when they did the same type of a special before SummerSlam and should be favored to win a rare wrestling ratings victory against the TNT movie debut. Bischoff in particular showed that the USA Network's counter-programming got to him as he made 3 television references to Vince McMahon being scared of Hogan's movie during the October 20th Nitro show. Japanese television rundown. September 14th, All Japan. 1. Hiroshi Hase pinned Tatsuo Nakano in 8:37 with a Northern Lights suplex. Nakano is a very short ex-UWFI wrestler who showed his weakness at traditional pro style in this match. Nevertheless, Hase is a great worker even at this point when pro wrestling is obviously secondary to him, and carried it to a surprisingly good match. 2 3/4 stars. 2. Williams and Albright and Yoshihiro Takayama beat Kawada and Taue and Honda in 17:20 when Williams pinned Honda after a back suplex. The match was really sloppy in spots, particularly when Takayama was in, since he's really bad. Still, when he's in with Kawada, they have a certain heat and Kawada's intensity carried it to be good spots. This was mainly to build up Kawada vs Takayama singles match for the next Budokan show. Overall decent. 2 stars. September 21st, All Japan. 1. Hayabusa and Jinsei Shinzaki beat Kobashi and Shiga in 2032. This turned out to be a pretty good match even though on paper you'd think it would be a style clash. Hayabusa is a good flying wrestler with no psychology and transitions, and Shinzaki is about the same, except not as good a flyer. However, Kobashi and Shiga managed to carry their weaknesses. It was solid work early but turned into a good match with all the near falls toward the finish. Hayabusa ended up pinning Shiga after a Michinoku Driver 2 and a Firebird Scorpio Flash. 3 1/2 stars. October 4th, New Japan. 1. Takaiwa pinned Samurai after a triple bomb and a Death Valley Driver in 11:58. Final 6 minutes aired on television. Pretty good match based on what aired. Heat level was okay but a lot of good moves and a somewhat of an upset finish. There was one scary spot where Takaiwa was going for a power bomb off the ropes and Samurai turned it into something of a very loose Hurricane Rana. 3 1/2 stars. 2. Otani and Kanemoto beat Liger and Kashin in 12:25 when Otani pinned Kashin with a German suplex. Excellent fast-moving match with all showing their style. At one point Kashin, who does a submission gimmick, got an ankle lock on Otani and Otani went for the ropes, but Liger pulled the ropes away from his reach and he had to go to another side to get the break. Kanemoto hit his rolling senton. Liger did a Frankensteiner off the top. Kashin did a great flying arm bar submission. 4 stars. 3. NWO Sting and Chono and Bagwell beat Yamazaki and Sasaki and Hirata in 12:11. The last 5:30 aired on television. It was a good fast-paced match ending with Chono hitting Hirata with a Yakuza kick and Sting pinning him after a facebuster. The finish came off weak but the match itself was good. 2 1/2 stars. 4. Muta and Tenzan beat Fujinami and Nagami in 9:44. At one point Muta went for his handspring elbow into the corner but Fujinami caught him with his Dragon Sleeper finisher. At another point Fujinami and Nagami had simultaneous figure fours on Muta and Tenzan respectively, but Muta blew mist in Fujinami's eyes to break the hold. Finish saw Tenzan use a headbutt off the top and Muta followed with a moonsault to score the surprise pin on Fujinami. Good match. 3 stars. 5. Hashimoto and Yasuda beat Nakanishi and Kojima in 14:01. Started slow but built into a very good match. Yasuda was his usual clumsy self, but almost all his somewhat comedic mannerisms get over in a way that builds the match and he's actually among the most improved wrestlers in the business when it comes to poise in the ring. Nakanishi isn't good, but at least is now solid and rarely shows any tentativeness. Kojima is a solid worker that has great facials to build a match, and Hashimoto's stiff comebacks heated up the crowd like usual. Big pop for Nakanishi getting Yasuda, who is 6'6", 330, in the rack with ease. Finish saw Hashimoto plant Kojima with a DDT. Then Yasuda ran over him like a freight train and scored a pin on him with a Tiger Driver. Yasuda scoring a clean pinfall on Kojima has to be considered a huge upset. 3 1/2 stars. October 11th, New Japan. 1. Riki Choshu and Sasaki beat Ohara and Nagami in 7:38. This was Choshu's final career match in his Tokuyama, which was the city he grew up in. As you can imagine, everything he did was over to the locals. This was just a fast-paced sprint match with Ohara and Nagami doing a great job as opponents. It was just one of those matches with superheat where everything clicked, ending with Choshu using a lariat and scorpion deathlock submission on Ohara. 3 3/4 stars. 2. Tenzan and Muta beat Osamu Kido and Junji Hirata in a tag team tournament match in 11:17. Only the last 3 minutes aired on television and it was good. They showed the spot where Muta hit Tenzan by accident coming off the top with a chop to build to the tease of Muta turning backface, which didn't happen, at least yet. Kido went for a Wakigatami, but Muta sprayed him with mist in the face and hit a facebuster on him for the pin. 3. Sasaki and Yamazaki won the tag team tournament, beating Muta and Tenzan in 15-21. They aired the last 7:30 on television, and it was really good. Surprising that they only televised 2 matches from the entire tournament. This turned into a hot match with lots of near falls. At one point Tenzan accidentally hit Muta, who walked out. Tenzan worked a stretch with Yamazaki, scoring several near falls on him. As he was on the top rope ready to deliver a second headbutt, Muta ran back in and blew mist in Tenzan's eyes. Chono then ran in and immediately kicked Muta to tease a Chono-Muta split that didn't occur yet. While this was going on, Yamazaki caught Tenzan in the cross arm breaker for the submission. 3 3/4 stars. 4. Otani retained the J-Crown, beating Takaiwa in 15-01. This was the typical New Japan pattern. A hot open, lots of mat work in the middle, and a strong finish. A very good title match, but nothing off the charts or memorable. Takaiwa got several near falls, but it didn't really register with the fans who were waiting for his powerbomb spot. Finally, he hit a double bomb and a Death Valley driver, which has been his winning sequence in big upsets of late, but Otani kicked out to a big pop. From this point on, the crowd was pretty into the match. Takaiwa hit a Death Valley driver off the middle rope, but Otani made it to the ropes. He tried a power bomb while standing on the middle ropes, but Otani turned it into a Hurricane Rana. Otani came back with a springboard dropkick to the back, a springboard spin kick, and a springboard DDT before using a dragon suplex for the pin. Really exciting finishing sequence. 3 3/4 stars. Mexico. Blue Panther debuted on October 17 for EMLL at Arena Mexico after jumping from AAA, and it is expected that Fuerza Guerrera and Heavy Metal are close to following him, which would further devastate AAA. Black Warrior is also back with EMLL after quitting Promo Azteca after his WCW bookings were cancelled in the Eric Bischoff/Conan apparent power play. Jorge Rojas, Promo Azteca part owner, and Jose Pianono Medina, EMLL booker, had a meeting for the 2 promotions to consolidate in some fashion to run Antonio Pena and AAA out of business because of all the lawsuits Pena has filed. The 2 groups won't share talent on television, but won't stand in the other's way when it comes to local promoters booking wrestlers from both promotions to appear, which is largely how it has been of late, but this made it official. EMLL has also gotten the rights to run Arena Neza every Friday night, which was AAA's main arena over the last several months, which the group was still often packing. As part of the agreement, Paco Alonso is trying to get Steel Sean Morley to return since he had been given such a huge push before leaving. However, the heat between Alonso and Victor Quiñones, stemming from Alonso canceling bookings of his wrestlers Quiñones had told the WWF would be coming, has remained, and Steel is part of Quiñones' group. They also want Silver King to return and drop the tag team titles he held with his brother, Dr. Wagner Jr., in the ring. All Japan. The 25th anniversary show on October 21 at Budokan Hall before an announced sellout of 16,300 fans saw Mitsuharu Misawa retain the Triple Crown, pinning Kenta Kobashi in 32:55 after a Tiger Driver. Toshiaki Kawada beat Yoshihiro Takayama of the Kingdom Promotion in 1822 after a kick to the face. Akira Taue pinned Johnny Ace in 16:54 after a dynamic Liger bomb. We were told that Misawa Kobashi was their expected excellent match, that Kawada Takayama wasn't as good as their match at Jingu Stadium last year, and that Taue vs. Ace was surprisingly good. Overall, we're told it was an excellent live show. In the 25th anniversary special match, Giant Baba and Stan Hansen and Jumbo Tsuruta beat Giant Kimala 2 and Tamon Honda and Masafuchi when Hansen lariated Honda. Teams for the tag team tournament, which starts on November 15, are Kawada and Taue, Steve Williams and Gary Albright, Misawa and Jun Akiyama, Kobashi and Ace, Hansen and Bobby Duncombe Jr., Johnny Smith and Lacrosse, Kimala 2 and Jun Izumida, Honda, and Takao Mori. The Blackjacks from the WWF and Hayabusa and Jinsei Shinzaki from FMW. Obviously it'll come down to the first 4 mentioned teams. Finals are December 5 at Budokan Hall. October 5 TV show did a 2.4 rating. New Japan. Keiji Muto and Masahiro Chono captured the IWGP Tag Team titles from Kensuke Sasaki and Kazuo Yamazaki in the main event of the October 19 show in Kobe before a sellout 8,000 fans. After the match, Muto and Chono pretty well threw down the belts and claimed that they don't need them, and Chono said they'd simply return the belts when they were done with them. The gimmick is that the NWO wants to capture the IWGP Heavyweight title from Sasaki as well. On October 31st, there is a title defense by Sasaki against a mystery NWO opponent, and the storyline is that if Sasaki retains the title, that the NWO through Eric Bischoff will pay him this incredible sum of money to join the NWO so the NWO can hold the IWGP Heavyweight and Tag Team titles. The finish of the tag match saw Muto have Sasaki in the figure 4 while Chono had Yamazaki in the STF at the same time. Matches added to the November 2nd Fukuoka Dome show are Takashi Iizuka and Kazuyuki Fujita vs. El Samurai and Kendo Kashin, Hiro Saito and Tatsutoshi Goto vs. Kengo Kimura and Akira Nagami, Nishiyoshi Ohara and Scott Norton and Hiroyoshi Tenzan vs. Manabu Nakanishi and Tadao Yasuda and Satoshi Kojima and Shinya Hashimoto vs. Hubert Numrich. Numrich is a 6'7" kickboxer from Holland who has 1 and 2 in NHB matches in Brazil and Holland, and appeared on a major 1995 K1 show in Japan, losing to Ernesto Hust. They are now pushing the Muto and Chono vs. Tatsumi Fujinami and Genichiro Tenryu match as the main event, and are going to put the Choshu vs. Sasaki match on just before intermission. Goto and Ohara have been teaming with NWO members in a feud against Heisei Ishion and also New Japan, as they are doing on this show, although they are not considered full-fledged members of the NWO yet. In Kobe, they teamed with Hiro Saito of the NWO, losing to Fujinami and Kimura and Akira Nagami. The annual tag team tournament will be from November 18th to December 8th with the finals at Osaka Furitsu Gym. No teams have been announced at press time. J-Crown champion Shinjiro Otani scored big singles wins on October 16th in Yokkaichi, beating Samurai, and October 19th in Kobe over Jushin Liger. October 4th TV show did a 2.7 rating. Other Japan notes. To go along with his win of the 6-man belts on October 14th, Atsushi Onita also captured FMW's World Brass Knucks tag titles, teaming with Yukihiro Kanemura to beat Mr. Ganasuke and Hisakatsu Oya on October 19th in Sendai. However, the Zen promotion, their answer to the NWO, didn't capture the promotion's World Heavyweight title as Masato Tanaka retained the title, pining Hideki Hasaka. The next day, Ganasuke and Oya agreed to join Onita's Zen promotion. The gimmick was that if Zen captured all 3 belts, they were going to hold them hostage, so to speak, unless FMW made the next tour into a Zen tour instead. Obviously that will have to wait until December. Onita is really mad because nobody, and that means nobody, is taking Zen seriously as a separate promotion, and he's having a hard time dealing with people not buying his angle. Former A.J.W wrestlers Asia Kong and Yoshiko Tamura won the main event on the October 19th Gia show in Sapporo, beating Chigusa Nagio and Sakura Hirota. Masakatsu Funaki faces Jason Godze in the main event of the Pancrase show on November 16th in Kobe. Michinoku Pro Wrestling's tentative plan is to shut down on January 16th but reopen in March, so even though it is a shoot that the promotion is doing poorly financially, the close down is a seasonal thing that they do every year, as the weather in the northeastern part of Japan where they promote is really bad in January and February, making travel difficult in the small towns, and they traditionally don't run shows during that period anyway. MPW will be doing a tag team tournament from October 25th with the finals on November 9th in Sendai. Teams will be Great Sasuke and Super Delphin, Dick Togo and Superboy, Tiger Mask, and Gran Hamada, Masato Yakashiji, and Naohiro Hoshikawa, Men's Teo and Shoichi Funaki, and Yone Jinjin and Pero Russo. The storyline on the Hakushi vs. Undertaker match from October 10th at Sumo Hall is that they had Shinzaki come to the US to dig up Hakushi from the grave, since he buried Hakushi when he left the WWF. Hakushi came to the ring in a casket, and when they opened it, it was as if Hakushi was raised from the dead when the bell rang to start the match. Reports from people who have seen the tape of the October 11th Tokyo Dome show from the pay-per-view were not favorable at all. Dan Severn vs. Kimo was said to have been a bad match, and Hickson Gracie vs. Nobuhiko Takada was like a one-sided squash, with Takada acting afraid of Gracie. The story is that Takada never actually studied Gracie tapes, and his manager didn't go looking for tapes of Gracie's previous fights until 3 days before the match, at which point it was way too late. Apparently Gracie was merciful in not pounding Takada's face any more than necessary before beating him. Because of the way the match ended, it is said that Takada now can't retire because he'd be going out on such a bad note. Right now he's left the country. What was amazing is that it was said that even though the crowd was a total pro wrestling crowd there to see the funeral of Takada, that it appeared 75% knew exactly what they were watching when it came to Vale Tudo spots and what they meant. Virtually all the smart fans knew ahead of time that Takada has zero chance to win, but there were a lot of fans who were super upset, wanting to trash the building because of how one-sided the match turned out to be. The Gary Goodridge vs. Oleg Toktarov finish was said to be sickeningly brutal. There is some talk of them trying to put together a Rickson Gracie vs. Marco Ruas match to headline the Pride 2 show on January 18th in Yokohama. There may have been a lot more than 5,000 freebies at the show because there were tons of postcards at convenience stores in Tokyo that you could redeem for one free ticket at the box office the day of the show. There will be a women's UFC on December 8th at the Nagoya International Center in an octagon cage. There will be 4 pro wrestlers involved: Tomoko Kitamura, Linus Asuka fighting under her real name, Yoko Takahashi, Megumi Yabushita, from JD, a former national judo champion, and Rieko Amano of JWP, along with 4 women from other fighting sports. Rings announced the bracketing of its annual Battle Dimension tournament, which starts October 25th at Tokyo Bay NK Hall and continues November 20th in Osaka, December 23rd in Fukuoka, and the finals on January 21st at Budokan Hall. First round matches are Yoshihisa Yamamoto vs. Christopher Haseman, Akira Maeda vs. Nikolai Zuev, Hansen Nyman vs. Kiyoshi Tamura, Joop Kasteel vs. Leo Hasdel, Ilukain Mikhail vs. X, Tsuyoshi Kosaka vs. Jariuskov, Bulgaria, Bitsade Teriel vs. Dick Frey, and Folk Han vs. Andrei Kopylov. Judging from the names and bracketing, this should be a total work tournament, with Osaka having Maeda vs. Yamamoto, Tamura vs. Kasteel, Kosaka vs. Mikhail, and Han vs. Teriel, and where it goes from there is more confusing. Rings ran October 14th at Korakuen Hall before a sellout 1,860, with Willie Peters scoring an upset over 95 kilograms. Champion Masayuki Naruse in a non-title match. The undercard featured 3 fighters from Australia, Aceman Dominic Delaney and Elvis Sinosik, losing to Alexander Otska, Wataru Sakata, and Tamura respectively. Saw the September 6th Pancrase show. The Yuki Kondo Jason DeLucia title match was a 27 minutes very even match, which appeared, as it figured, that it could have gone either way, with Kondo scoring a submission just a few minutes before the time limit. John LeBay's debut saw him a little confused on the rules and lose a point due to an accidental violation, which spelled the difference in what was otherwise a pretty even match against Kyuma Kunyoku. Akira Maeda went berserk about the Pride 1 show in a Rings press conference after the Korakuen Hall show. He challenged Rickson Gracie before he retires in September, but said he only would do the match in Rings, which I guess is his way to save face. Add Manami Toyota and Momoe Nakanishi vs. Kaoru Ito and Nani Takahashi from A.J.W. to the Plum Marco Memorial Show on October 30th in Tokyo. Big Japan will be running its final big show of the year on December 8th at Tokyo Ota Ward Gym. FMW has major shows on December 19th at Tokyo Komazawa Olympic Gym, December 20th in Osaka, December 21st in Nagoya, and December 22nd at Korakuen Hall. Mr. Hito Katsuchi Adaki will have his retirement match on November 22nd in Osaka against Jiro Inazuma, Jiri Moro. Dan Severn appears for IWA from October 27th to October 31st. On October 27th in Chiba he faces Daiko Kubo Benkei in what is billed as a UFC rules match. On October 28th in Gifu he defends the NWA title against Leatherface, Rick Patterson. October 30th he teams with Great Kabuki against Keizo Matsuda and Keisuke Yamada, and October 31st in Odawara he teams with Kabuki against Leatherface and Freddy Krueger, Doug Gilbert. Big Japan on October 31st, Halloween, is doing a dry ice death match. Here and there. Another weekly wrestling tradition will be biting the dust in a few weeks. The Dallas Sportatorium, which has hosted wrestling dating back several decades, will be torn down in a few weeks, and there will be a drive-through liquor store built on the property. The last pro wrestling event in the building will be the CWA show on November 14th. Negotiations to buy the land and put up the liquor store have been rumored for some time, and there was even an attempt to keep the building from being torn down by making it a local institution. Insert your own joke. The Sportatorium housed weekly wrestling in Texas during its early 70s glory period on Tuesday nights, and then in the 80s moved to the Friday nights that became its new tradition during the heyday of the Von Erichs and the Freebirds. Since the folding of the world-class promotion, one new group after another has booked Friday night shows in the building, but none have had anything that could be labeled success in many years. The CWA, which was being run by wrestler Mike Buster Blackheart, had been drawing between 75 and 150 for the recent shows. The latest USWA show on October 18th in Amarillo drew a crowd estimated at 4,500. The local newspaper gave the count as 5,100, which is several hundred more than the Terry Funk Big Show last month drew in the same building in a show billed as Battle of the Belts. In the 5 title matches, middleweight champion Steve Nelson beat Taichi Hayashi with a choke in 6:06. The first light heavyweight champion was created as favorite Paul Jones. EFC Shudo beat Tony Castillo in 12:21 with a choke. The women's light heavyweight champion Lisa Hunt beat Eva Vandiver in 2:28 with a choke. The first heavyweight champion was decided as Evan Tanner beat Heath Herring in 3:18, and the first lightweight champion was crowned as Michael Buell beat Diego Acosta in 8:16 with a triangle choke. Nelson is particularly high on Tanner, who is his group's first heavyweight champion, a former high school state champion, who also won the group's first heavyweight tournament even though he weighs closer to 195 pounds. Nelson believes he could do some serious damage in UFC or in shoot matches in Japan in the under 200 weight class. In addition, they had a middleweight tournament won by Frank Trigg, an assistant wrestling coach at the University of Oklahoma, who upset Ali Elias with a knee to the head in 10:56 in the first round and then won both his semifinal and final match. Even though Trigg was billed from Norman, Oklahoma, and there is a natural Oklahoma-Texas rivalry, he became a big fan favorite as they were chanting his name after his first round upset. Becky Levi, with Dan Severn in her corner, who has fought previously in both New York and Japan and is 2-0 in NHB, beat Leslie Brace, who literally came out of the audience at the last show when Levi challenged any woman in the house to a match, in 1:40 with a choke. Nelson isn't going to run another show until March, at which point he's planning on bringing back James Stone, ECW's Little Guido, to face him in one of the main events, because he feels the city needs a rest from the bi-monthly shows, and he needs a rest from promoting since he has to get in his best shape for a Vale Tudo match on November 29th in Japan while also concentrating on coaching local high school wrestling. Nelson offered Ralph Gracie $10,000 for a rematch. They had a match on an EFC pay-per-view show which Gracie won in about 50 seconds, but Gracie came back asking for $30,000. The latest on the USWA is that the actual final TV show on WMC TV in Memphis was on October 11th, and not October 4th as we reported, which was another replay show. The show has since been cancelled and there is really nothing to report on regarding the court case. Burt Prentice and Jerry Jarrett are going to open up several cities in the Nashville area, and Prentice is attempting to get television on in Memphis as well. Terry Funk worked on October 18th in Hanover, Germany for the CWA challenging Marshall Duke Drosy, for the CWA heavyweight title, and Duke won the match in about 30 minutes to keep the title. The October 18th Douglasville, Georgia newspaper had a story on Craig Pittman, who is apparently still under contract with WCW until the end of the year, but will be cut loose at that point. Pittman said that he hopes to either go to the WWF or a Japanese group next year. Emmanuel Yarbrough, a 640-pound sumo wrestler who has done some pro wrestling in Austria doing a sumo gimmick for Otto Wanz, does a comical advice column in a magazine called Giant Robot, which is largely about Japanese culture and has had quite a few articles over the years on both NHB and pro wrestling. It reminds me of the fictitious Dear Abby column in the newsletter Chokehold a few years back, where people would send Dear Abby type questions but the answers would be from someone doing an Abdullah the Butcher character. Ian Rotten's IWA is planning an Eddie Gilbert Memorial Show in Louisville in February, bringing in Austin Idol and Ron Garvin. NHB. During a Jay Leno monologue this past week, they showed footage of the riot from the Renzo Gracie vs. Eugenio Tato Vale Tudo show in Brazil a few weeks back. Guy Mesder of Pancrase is running a show on October 24th in Dallas which will feature Lions Den fighters going against mainly fighters under the Phyllis Lee management. ECW rundown of the October 18th show from the ECW arena before a packed house estimated at around 1,600. The show opened with Bam Bam Bigelow beating Mikey Whipwreck in a match more notable for what happened in the stands than in the ring. While fighting in the crowd, a fan threw a punch at Whipwreck hard enough that it gave him a black eye, and then ran out of the building. Much of the dressing room emptied and ran out of the building as well, searching the parking lot and looking for the fan, who escaped before they found him and probably would have half killed him. There were several reports that this killed the early momentum of the show and came off as totally unprofessional because it's something you would never see at either a WWF or WCW show. It was the third out of the ring strange incident in 3 weekend house shows. Paul Diamond pinned Spike Dudley. FBI won the tag titles from New Jack and John Cronus due to interference from the Dudleys. Axel Rotten and Balls Mahoney beat the Dudleys. Great Sasuke pinned Al Snow. Justin Credible, who beat Sasuke 2 days earlier in Queens, New York and is doing a long-term program with him, was on the stage taunting Sasuke and later pile-drove someone on the stage and Sasuke ran up the stage to make the save. From all accounts, Sasuke wasn't impressive due to numerous serious leg injuries he's working with. Taz retained the TV title going to a no contest with Rob Van Dam. Van Dam said that he wanted the building renamed the WWF Arena. This was said to have been a good match. The Pit Bulls and Lance Wright came out and attacked Taz, who made his own comeback cleaning house on both of them. It wound up with Bigelow attacking Taz and then doing a pull-apart with the two of them. The angle was said to have come off a lot more flat in person than it sounds no paper. Chris Condito and Lance Storm, as the new apprentice of the Triple Threat, beat Doug Furnas and Phil LaFon in a good match. While Furnas and LaFon are booked a few more times for ECW, this was the last major match with the promotion they were scheduled for. The final was a three-way dance with Sabu winning over Tommy Dreamer and Shane Douglas. Among the highlights were both Francine and Beulah getting pile-driven and a woman in the crowd flashing her boobs, which stole the heat from the participants before the match started. Paul Heyman got on the house mic and said something to the effect of, "Now that we've all seen what a lousy pair looks like." The latest deal with the Pit Bulls is that Heyman was simply looking for someone to put Taz over, theoretically on the pay-per-view, although the match may take place on November 8th at ECW Arena if he decides to go with Taz versus Van Dam at the pay-per-view. They were actually to do the angle 2 nights earlier in Queens, but due to the behind-the-scenes problems with Pitbull No. 2 and New Jack, the angle was squashed for 2 more days. On October 17th in Downingtown, Pennsylvania, before about 850 fans, they had a regular show with Douglas and Condito over Sabu and Van Dam and New Jack and Cronus over Dudley's in a bloodbath on top. As Douglas was coming down the aisle, supposedly a teenage girl pulled his hair. As the reports we received said, he spit in the girl's face and she spit back in his face. At this point, Francine and the girl traded blows. Another fan threw a chair at Francine and security broke it up about 15 seconds before a full-fledged riot was about to take place. The girl then called the police and claimed that Douglas had punched her in the stomach. The police came down and talked with Douglas, who denied he punched the girl, and at this point no charges had been filed. Sandman was at all the shows but never made an appearance before the crowd, resting up his internal injuries. Dreamer worked and was wearing a brace to protect his heel, but didn't seem off in the ring. October 16th in Queens, New York, for a TV taping drew a sellout of 900 with New Jack and Cronus winning a three-way dance over Dudley's and Rotten and Mahoney in a major bloodbath on top. The biggest item there was something backstage. Apparently as a rib, New Jack told Joel Gertner that he was going to blade and gave him a large blade to cut himself. Gertner had never juiced before and went to Pitbull No. 2 about it. PB No. 2 freaked out, at first thinking that since it was New York State, that they wouldn't be able to blade, not realizing the political situation in New York has changed since the commission, which has always from appearance sake seemed to be in the WWF's pocket, no longer hassles ECW about blood now that ECW and WWF are working together, and recognizing other problems like the Eric Kulas incident. It turned into a heated discussion with both calling each other major names like jobber and the dreaded N-word. Paul Heyman claims no blows were thrown, although several others say that New Jack threw 2 punches at Pitbull, which didn't faze him at all, and they were pulled apart by the other wrestlers. At one point, the wrestlers let them go, because a number of them were tired of New Jack and the feeling was in a fight between the two, that the much larger Pitbull would take him. The two ended up rolling on the floor when Heyman came in the room and they were pulled apart and broken up. Pitbull was sent home by Heyman so he didn't do his angle that night, and Heyman was yelling and screaming at New Jack. By Saturday the two had shaken hands and there were no hints of problems when they were at the arena. Among the people backstage at the shows included Manny Fernandez, looking for work but don't expect him to be used, Taka Michinoku, who may work a few dates with ECW against Great Sasuke in the future, and Izuki Yamazaki of the 1980s Jumping Bomb Angels tag team. She retired from wrestling and moved from Japan to New York, where she's been living for a number of years. Jerry Lynn is out of action with a broken foot but is expected back next weekend. Aaron O'Grady from Northern California's All-Pro Wrestling promotion will be given a tryout shortly and likely work an undercard promotion with Spike Dudley, who started out at the same wrestling school. Storm will be finishing up as a regular with War in Japan and become a full-timer for ECW. Several of the wrestlers from Michinoku Pro Wrestling will be brought in early next year as part of the Sasuke vs. Credible feud. WCW. The U.S. title was reversed back to Curt Hennig after the October 13th Nitro match with Diamond Dallas Page. The cover story was that Roddy Piper, after talking with Randy Anderson, went with his version even though he had gone on television and reversed Anderson's decision. The whole deal came across like one of those mid-80s Jim Crockett or late 70s Vern Gagne angles where you have the fans leave the building telling them they'd seen a title change, only to reverse it on television 1 week later. The original plan by Terry Taylor was for Page to win the title, which was the idea until at least late that afternoon, but it was overruled just before the show started. Nitro on October 20th from Biloxi, Mississippi drew 5,950, paying $123,075. Lanny Poffo was involved in a dark match, although we don't know his opponent or the result. The show opened with them showing Scott Norton, Conan, Vincent and Curt Hennig laid out on the concrete with Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage and Eric Bischoff screaming about it. They strongly hinted that Roddy Piper, Page and Sting had done it, as there was a baseball bat, a Piper t-shirt and a shirt that looked like one Page would wear on the ground. They began yelling and screaming that before the night was over they'd get their revenge on Piper, Sting, and Page. Eddie Guerrero pinned Chris Benoit in 7-14 with a frog splash in a match that was nothing short of super. Guerrero's chest was beaten raw by Benoit's chops. Bill Goldberg, who got a noticeable pop, tackled and suplexed Wrath for the pin in only 20 seconds. Don't think for a second that Goldberg doing the gimmick where he walks to the ring like Shamrock, with the gloves like Shamrock, that WCW isn't doing an in-your-face gimmick, and that they are taking somebody with no name and creating their own Shamrock. And WWF had the real thing and they turned him into just another pro wrestler. Steve McMichael had a confrontation with Goldberg. McMichael then pinned Mortis with a tombstone in 4:56. The match was better than you'd think, which is a real credit to Mortis. McMichael did an interview and Deborah came out promising a big surprise. In these confrontations where Deborah just belittles Steve and Steve stands there and punches furniture, McMichael once again comes off really bad. They aired another Raven promo and a promo with Rey Mysterio Jr. trying to get over the importance of his mask. Yuji Nagata beat Juventud Guerrera in 2:23 with a Nagata lock, a version of a figure 4. Work was real good, although with Raven and his group coming out, the crowd didn't react to anything in the match. Los Villanos and Damien were in the ring when Giant came out to do a promo and he destroyed all three, running down Kevin Nash, saying that kids in high school after arthroscopic surgery are back in 2 days, and used Nash's jackknife on Villano V. Mysterio Jr. beat Disco Inferno in a TV title match via DQ in 2:17 when Guerrero interfered. It was hard to take seriously because of the size problem, but both wrestlers did a great job in this match. Jacqueline jumped Disco after the match, both in the ring and again in the aisle. Hogan, Savage and Bischoff came out issuing challenges. Bischoff went crazy on Vince McMahon, saying how McMahon and the USA Network were afraid of the Escape from Devil's Island movie that WWF and USA are putting their Survivor Series flashback special on head-to-head against on October 28th. Curt Hennig pinned Dean Malenko in 9:48 with a fisherman's suplex. This was a good match, although the finishing sequence was weak, as Malenko did a million things to Hennig and couldn't beat him, and Hennig basically did one move out of nowhere to beat Malenko. Hennig has really looked a lot better of late. There was one huge negative in this match which reminded me of late 80s NWA/WCW just before it went down the tubes financially. When Malenko locked on the cloverleaf, instead of the crowd popping like there may have been an upset or title change forthcoming, you can see the entire crowd look to the back waiting for the run-in. When Hennig got to the ropes to break the finisher, nobody was paying attention. Scott Norton pinned Ray Traylor in 3:12 after Vincent sprayed paint in Traylor's face and Norton used a clothesline. Hennig, Conan and Hall all came out as well, and they destroyed Traylor after the match. Lex Luger beat Booker T in 6:30 with a rack. This was actually a good match, which would be a first for Luger in a long time. Booker T has a lot of potential as a single, particularly if he gets more experience at doing singles matches. They said Stevie Ray wasn't there due to an Achilles tendon injury, and even though the injury is legit, the fact is Ray worked house shows over the weekend. Luger did an interview and Larry Zbyszko came out. Zbyszko said he was going to call it down the middle. Luger made a weird face about Zbyszko's comments as a tease. Main event saw Scott Hall pin Scott Steiner in 10:36 of a 2 1/4 stars match. Hall did the same interview he does every week, although Biloxi was different from almost every city in that they booed him out of the building rather than cheered his "Did you people come to see WCW or are you here to see the dash?" spiel. Hall KO'd the ref, and then Steiner used a tiger driver on him but no ref to count the fall. Then Hall used the edge on Steiner and a masked ref came out and counted the fall. The masked ref appeared to be Vincent. Bischoff and Hogan came out with Bischoff ripping on McMahon again. Another group of Stings, this time being Page and Piper, came out but soon were overwhelmed by the entire NWO and the cage was dropped. Then the real Sting came from the ceiling and cleaned house, although they killed the cage gimmick by how easily all the NWO members were simply able to escape from the inescapable cage before the Hogan-Piper pay-per-view match. Overall, a very entertaining show. Ric Flair was in Biloxi but for some reason wasn't booked to appear on the show. Bischoff had a meeting with all the wrestlers before the October 13th Nitro in Tampa. He talked about attending Brian Pillman's funeral and then said that he wasn't naive enough to think that there's no drug problem in WCW, but that he hasn't personally seen any examples of major abuse. He asked any wrestler that if they have a problem to go to him and the company would take care of the wrestler and treat the problem like it was an injury, and brought up that wrestlers that have been hurt on the job have been paid while injured. Actually, there is a historical problem some had with that statement, remembering both Steve Austin and Ricky Steamboat, particularly in the case of Steamboat, who may have been the most unselfish worker in the company's history, who were both fired by the company after suffering injuries. He said that on the October 6th Raw that they used the word ass 17 times, on October 20th it seemed like they used the word 117 times, and said that WCW is going in the opposite direction of WWF. He said that Six could no longer do the Bronco ride spot and that the NWO guys would no longer point to their crotch because he wanted a clear differential between the two products. His explanation was that there are very few national advertisers that touch pro wrestling to begin with, and he was afraid the more lewd, harder edge direction of the WWF would erode the advertising base for both companies. He claimed that some of the advertisers are already on the verge of pulling out of WWF, and that the direction WWF was going to hurt the entire business. He claimed WWF would be out of business within 6 months. Actually, I believe he used the word that he guaranteed, which I guess was his way of trying to scare people from jumping. Don't hold your breath waiting for that one. He said he was tired of all the whining among the wrestlers, saying that they'll look back at this period in the future as one of the greatest periods in their careers. He brought up that the schedule would be increasing next year. He also said something to the effect that there are only 3 wrestlers in the room that have ever put asses in the seats, and said they were Hogan, Piper and Savage, and said he was willing to debate anyone if they disagreed with that assessment. The description is that there was steam coming out of Ric Flair's ears, and several others were fuming on the inside as well. The belief is he dissed Flair since the two are in a major contract negotiation period, and he was trying to send the hint to Flair that the company doesn't need him. As far as Flair's future is concerned, there is no question he is considering a WWF jump, but to call it a sure thing at this point is way premature. No doubt Flair knows how the game is played, and he'll get word out to get the best offer. Bischoff's deal with Jeff Jarrett was his own way to try and avert the leverage of negotiating publicly with both sides, since Jarrett was far more expendable to make an example out of than Flair. Rob Van Dam showed up at the tapings in Orlando one day, but don't read anything into that other than trying to show up so the word would get out to get his outsider gimmick over in ECW. For the most part, the newcomers at the Universal tapings looked bad, although David Finlay was an exception to that rule. WCW in 1998 will be getting an $8 million increase in its budget slated for talent. Marcus Bagwell will be out of action for about 3 weeks after undergoing arthroscopic knee surgery. They taped a few angles for the Saturday night show to put Rey Mysterio Jr. and the Giant together as a tag team, possibly to feud with Scott Norton and Bagwell. The Rey and Giant gimmick has a lot of potential, but Giant is really mad about the pairing, feeling it reduces him to a mid-card comedy performer. With Nash not being around, a Hall/Nash contingent's power has been dropping like the 1929 stock market. Norman Smiley received a $75,000 per year contract, and I believe that is also around the figure that Barry Horowitz, Bobby Blaze, Kendall Windham and Chris Adams have signed for. The angles with all the stings were put together by Hogan and Kevin Sullivan. Rey Mysterio Jr. is said to be very unhappy about losing his mask at Havoc. Although that is the plan, the last we've heard, it may be something that could change as late as the last minute. Mysterio Jr. signed an agent to negotiate with WCW for him, who asked for his current contract. I've heard it as being both $200,000 and $240,000 depending on the source, to be up to $350,000. Meng vs. Bill Goldberg will be added as a surprise match on the Havoc pay-per-view. It's the internal deal of trying to get Goldberg over as a shooter by beating Meng, the reputed toughest man in the business. The problem with that theory is the only people who have any clue that Meng is that tough are the boys themselves because of his rep, and to the fans he's just another lower card guy who has been around forever and means nothing. Steve Regal suffered a neck injury and his legs went momentarily numb after getting the Tombstone piledriver from McMichael on October 13th, and he was out of action. Todd Pettingill, who was dropped by the WWF due to his large contract, $300,000 per, and WWF cutting back, was attempting to get into WCW. House shows this past week saw the TV taping on October 14th in Fort Myers, Florida draw 2,465, paying $36,440. October 18th in Houston drew a sellout of $7,887 and $153,075 at the Astro Arena. The show actually sold out a few days in advance, and October 19th in Lake Charles, Louisiana drew $4,766 and $67,000. We don't have merchandise figures for Fort Myers, but Houston and Lake Charles combined for $102,767, which is $8.12 per head. In Houston, Chris Benoit and Steve McMichael tagged up as the Four Horsemen against the NWO, which turned out to be Scott Norton and Vincent, and Arn Anderson, who got a huge pop, was in their corner. However, after working Houston and Lake Charles, Anderson's bookings in the Horseman corner in November, which include matches in the old Mid-Atlantic territory, were all pulled. In the Mysterio Jr. vs. Conan match, the finish saw Conan unmask Mysterio Jr. and parade around with the mask, but he had a second mask underneath, and while Conan had his back turned, Mysterio Jr. pinned him with the springboard Hurricane Rana. Scott Hall did a clean submission job for Luger's rack. The main event spot was given to Harlem Heat, since they are from Houston, and they beat Public Enemy. I was told Heat got a good face reaction, but that the majority of the fans don't know they are from Houston to begin with. As is usually the case at the house shows, Eddie Guerrero vs. Dean Malenko was the best match. Among those put over on the Saturday night tapings on October 14th were John Noor, Barry Darsow, Luis Piccoli, Kendall Windham, and Chris Adams. Adams looked average. They also had a Mysterio Jr. win over Bagwell that looked ridiculous for obvious reasons. Bobby Eaton and Joey Maggs were nearly fired, but it was overruled after a lot of politicking by Terry Taylor because the two have been so loyal to the company and are generally well liked. Weekend ratings for October 18th saw main event at 1.4, Saturday night at 2.0 and pro at 1.3. For the weekend of October 11th it was main event at 1.5, Saturday night at 1.6, one of the lowest in history, and pro at 1.1, also one of its lowest in history. As of October 20th, the Nitro in Cincinnati on November 17th, with tickets have only been on sale for 3 days, had sold 6,748 tickets for $122,690. Hogan was on Regis and Kathy Lee this week to promote the pay-per-view and the movie. There was a front-page story in the Greensboro newspaper about a barber shop which is called the NWO Barber Shop, and the walls are filled with wrestling paraphernalia, not only of NWO but of wrestling in general. Expect Disco Inferno to use the Stone Cold Stunner, with another name, perhaps the Chart Buster, as his new finishing hold, which would be retaliation for the belief that WWF had Mark Marrow use the Diamond Cutter as the TKO, as his new finisher. WWF. Steve Austin didn't work the house shows over the weekend as advertised. On both October 18th in Fort Worth and October 19th in Wichita, Austin did run-ins after Owen Hart retained the IC title against Dude Love, giving Hart a stunner and leaving him laying to big pops. The general belief is that Austin, after being given the bad news last week by Dr. Joseph Torg in Philadelphia that he should rest another 2 months and get another evaluation at that time to determine whether he should return, won't be back for Survivor Series. There has been some criticism within the industry of them not letting fans know what Austin's status is. Austin is still being advertised at all house shows, and officially the WWF is stating the injury is a day-to-day thing and that the reports he'd be out for another 2 months are exaggerated. The complete Survivor Series card as of a few days before press time was listed as Brett vs. Shawn Michaels, Owen vs. Austin, Mankind vs. Kane, and a series of 8-man elimination matches: Ken Shamrock and Ahmed Johnson and LOD vs. Nation of Domination, DOA vs. Truth Commission, Vader and Patriot and Goldust, and Mark Marrow vs. Davey Boy Smith and Jim Neidhart and Glenn Kulka, a former Canadian Football League player who has been under a WWF developmental contract for some time and was trained by Bret Hart and Leo Burke and worked a few weeks in Eastern Canada where reports were he was exceedingly green but showed potential, and TBA, and Headbangers and Blackjacks vs. Godwins and Billy Gunn and Jesse Jam. After this lineup was released, there were words that Jim Ross was going to give the card a minor revision, but we have no idea if or what that means. There had been some talk of bringing in a women's match using Asia Kong and Kyoko Inoue, but I guess that must have fallen through. A press conference was held on October 16th in Stamford, Connecticut with Vince McMahon, Jim Ross, Bruce Pritchard, Great Sasuke and Victor Quiñones to announce the signing of Taka Michinoku. The figures released in Japan, and I'm under the assumption these numbers aren't real, although the 3-year time frame is, that he signed a 3-year deal at $333,000 per year. They also said that McMahon wrote a check for $250,000 for Great Sasuke and would give it to him if he gave McMahon the old WWF Junior Heavyweight and Light Heavyweight belts. That latter deal is a gimmick for sure. As mentioned here before, WWF has wanted New Japan to stop calling the Light Heavyweight belt, which is part of the J Crown currently held by Shinjiro Otani, a WWF belt. McMahon claimed that the WWF hasn't recognized either belt since 1984, Actually, it would be 1985 when the WWF and New Japan broke off their business relationship. The WWF Junior Heavyweight title, created in 1978 for Tatsumi Fujinami, was dropped by New Japan in 1985 and replaced in 1986 by the IWGP Junior Heavyweight title. The WWF will be starting its light heavyweight title tournament on November 3rd in Hershey, Pennsylvania, after numerous delays due to problems working with both Japan and Mexican offices. Raw's run-ins on October 20th in Oklahoma City drew 8,334, paying $110,154. It opened with Rocky Maivia and Kama Mustafa beating Ken Shamrock and Ahmed Johnson in 6:44 when Maivia pinned Shamrock after Farouk hit him with Rick Rude's Halliburton briefcase. They were trying to tease an affiliation between DX, Michaels Group, and Nation of Domination. Match was a lot better than you'd think. In fact, it was a good match, as both Shamrock and Maivia are continuing to show noticeable improvement as workers, and Johnson was kept out of the ring most of the way. After the match, the Godwins attacked the LOD with garbage cans. They went to the Nation of Domination locker room, which was trashed, and they tried to heavily play the race card, acting like the Hart Foundation did it, although it'll probably be revealed it was actually DX that did it to get the Nation of Domination mad at Hart Foundation. Whenever they do the race stuff, it comes off so desperate. Farouk challenged Brett to come out, and they did a match with lots of outside interference, and Brett won when Austin came out of the audience and used the stunner on Farouk, and Brett pinned him in 8:15 of a bad match. Jeff Jarrett came out and did a so-called shoot interview, ripping on everyone, saying he refused Bischoff's offer, got mad at what Bischoff said about pulling the offer off the table. The live crowd had absolutely no clue what he was talking about, and this got no reaction. He said he was one of the youngest and most talented workers in WCW, and they held him back, working him with a football player that doesn't know how to lock up and his wife who gives new meaning to the word dumb blonde. He said Bischoff held him back out of ignorance and inexperience, but then ripped on McMahon for the country music gimmick he had on his first go-around and said the gimmick sucked. He said when he was in WWF, he worked with a drug addict, a black man who can't speak English, and a clown. He said McMahon didn't use him right because he knew that his father was the only promoter McMahon didn't put out of business, and then challenged Brett, Shawn, and Austin. Mark Mero pinned Brian Christopher in 4:12 with his TKO, Diamond Cutter. During the match, Jerry Lawler put a Steve Austin hat on Sable. Mero saw it and threw the hat in the crowd and yelled at Sable. They were trying to push this as a big size difference with a heavyweight against a light heavyweight, except there didn't look to be all that much of a size difference between the two. It also kind of buries the light heavyweight division when an opening match heavyweight beats the guy who will either win the tournament or go to the finals. Shawn Michaels and Owen Hart went to a no contest in 9:42 after tons of outside interference by DX, Hart Foundation, and Austin. Match was good, but due to all the interference, a non-finish, and a work rate slightly below what you'd figure from these two, it was only 3 stars. Undertaker did an interview saying he would never wrestle Kane, which of course guarantees that he will. The idea is to hold the match off until WrestleMania. Dude Love was in the ring and Kane came out and destroyed him with 2 choke slams on the ramp. Kane didn't sell anything, including a chair to the head. The Kane gimmick is going to get over huge. Later in the show, Dude did an interview as Mankind challenging Kane to a match. Billy Gunn, as Badass Billy Gunn, and Road Dogg Jesse Jam forming a tag team beat Headbangers when Gunn destroyed a boombox over Thrasher's head in 4:04 and Thrasher juiced. So bout. It's one thing for Steve Austin or Shawn Michaels as the top stars to be running down McMahon, but when they have an opening match guy like Jam do it, it just slightly loses its effect. Takamichi Noku pinned Yoshihiro Tajiri, or Tajiri Yoshihiro as Sonny called him, and the announcer simply just called him Tajiri, of the Big Japan promotion with his Michinoku driver 2 and 255. Too short, but the two were both great. Jim Cornette did another editorial on Phil Mushnick. Cornette told people to write letters to TV Guide about Mushnick and put the address of the magazine on the screen. Actually, Cornette and Jim Ross' responses to Eric Bischoff's statements about how the best thing for WCW is for Cornette and Ross to be in power in WWF have made all three, Cornette, Ross, and Bischoff, look bad. Bischoff comes off as a jerk to most people because he's always half in his heel character, he's half working all the time trying to get under people's skin, and how can you respond or take seriously a statement that is essentially a partial work, particularly if you are the people whose skin the work is designed to get under? But by Cornette and Ross responding to it so strongly, even though Ross' response may come across as more reasoned out and logical than Bischoff's put-downs designed to be mean-spirited with little thought given to them except trying to get under their skin, and Cornette's responses actually makes Bischoff's original statements look totally foolish, it still puts them all in the same category to a degree just for responding. Don't expect it to end because this is the wrestling industry where everyone has to get in the last word. In regard to the Mushnick situation, the New York Post received more than 1,000 hate letters and emails this past week stemming from the Cornette editorial, and TV Guide received a great deal more than that. Unfortunately for the image of wrestling fans to the general media, most of the responses only confirmed Mushnick's belief about most wrestling fans, because the responses were more along the lines of "suck my dick and blow me" rather than addressing any issues. Mushnick himself was mad because of several points that Cornette claimed on October 13th. He never made fun of Pillman's death, as was said. He only stated that if it were a baseball or basketball player of similar stature dying under the same circumstances, it would be front-page news, particularly if things happened with the frequency they do to such a small population base of men working in this industry. But since it's a pro wrestler, the media dismisses it as a cartoon and doesn't take it seriously. It was a criticism of the media's lack of coverage of pro wrestling when reality is involved, and not anything else, which, quite frankly, is an inarguably valid point. He was amazed that the wrestling fans who blamed him for making fun of Pillman's death didn't even realize that it was the WWF using Pillman's death trying to score not only ratings points the day after but also use it as a way to criticize him. He also said that Cornette's statements about him wanting pro wrestling abolished were total fantasy. He said he has nothing against pro wrestling per se, but he does have something against the way Vince McMahon and Ted Turner market their pro wrestling to young children and then teach them hate, racism, sexism, etc. Granted that Mushnick's being so critical of an industry he watches very little of does make his actual criticisms be something that should be addressed. Doing the second editorial only confirmed my initial belief that the WWF is afraid of what an outside investigation into the last few months of the life of Brian Pillman and who knew what would reveal, and figure Mushnick is the reporter most likely to do it, so they want to strike first and make anything he writes turn into something that can divert attention from the real issues by claiming personal vendetta, which is a company track record that dates back many years when it gets in tough situations. The problem is that by calling attention to the subject so closely on television, particularly if they keep it up, may end up making it more of an issue, and also increases the possibility that someone who isn't Mushnick will try and figure out what the real story is, and the company will only look worse in the long run. You'd think McMahon would have learned the game by now, and while the "I'm mad as hell and not going to take it anymore" works well with his sheep wrestling fans, that to outsiders looking in, it raises a lot of questions. On October 22nd, the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office said it would be about another week before a cause of death is released on Pillman. There is a memorial fund being set up for Pillman at 1B Quaker Ridge Road number 144, New Rochelle, New York 10804. The tapings on October 21st in Tulsa, Oklahoma drew a sellout, which I believe is around 7,000 fans at the convention center. For Shotgun on November 1st, which was taped first, Michinoku and Scott Taylor beat Christopher and Tajiri, and after the match Christopher turned on Tajiri. Neidhart beat Patriot via DQ. Bulldog interfered, and then Goldust interfered. Neidhart grabbed Marlena's purse, although it was obvious Marlena was practically handing it to him, to start the tease for the Goldust/Marlena split, but Patriot got it away from him and used it, and the ref saw it and opened the purse, found a brick inside and DQ'd Patriot. Recon, with the Truth Commission and Michaels coming to the ring with him, beat Chains. Michaels attacked Crush, and while the ref was distracted, Interrogator beat up Chains to lead to the pin. Headbangers beat Godwins, but Godwins left Bangers laying after the match. For October 27th Raw, Nation of Domination comes out claiming the WWF is racist and challenge Hart Foundation to a match on November 3rd, which is accepted. Michaels then stirs everyone up and claims Hart Foundation spray-painted the dreaded N-word on the wall of the Nation of Domination dressing room. Helmsley beat Goldust. Johnson beat Owen Hart via DQ in an IC title match when Austin gave the stunner to Johnson to keep him from winning the title. Mankind challenges Kane to a match, but Sergeant Slaughter refuses to sign it. Mankind then puts the claw on Slaughter and is pulled off. Don't know the finish of Brett versus Shamrock, but probably a no contest when Michaels interfered. Gunn and Jean beat Blackjacks using a chair. DX interview, and Michaels pulls down his pants while Chyna and Triple H hold signs over his private parts, but he tries to jump in the air over the signs. Mero pinned Funk using the TKO cutter. LOD kept tag titles, beating Perez and Vega. Gunn and Jean grab the LOD spikes and walk around the ring wearing them, but LOD chase them to the back. In a dark match, Undertaker beat Brett via DQ due to interference by Bulldog and Neidhart. Mark Mero has now been told to grow his hair back. Yokozuna, who is now expected to start back this coming weekend, recently filmed a Coca-Cola commercial. Dr. Wagner Jr. was supposed to start at the tapings this week but canceled due to an injury. PJ Walker was given his release from his WWF contract to become an ECW regular. The New York Times ran a story about the Monday Night Wrestling, with a WWF slant a few weeks ago, largely based on an interview with the now departed Pettingill. The story said that the TNT network created the World Championship Wrestling promotion to compete with WWF when it wasn't Kerry Braves games on Monday nights. That sentence may have set some kind of a record for inaccuracies. The story acted as if the ratings were close every week, with USA just below a 3 and TNT mid-3s. Weekend ratings for the October 18th weekend saw Livewire at 1.4 and Superstar at 1.8. For the October 11th weekend, Livewire did a 1.4 and Superstars a 1.6. Weekend house shows saw October 18th in Fort Worth draw 5,266 paying $83,916 and October 19th in Wichita drew 7,497 and $114,468. Merchandise for the two shows in Oklahoma City totaled $139,586 or $6.62 per head. The finish of the Shamrock vs. Vader match from Kawasaki Stadium as far as Vader going over was the planned ending, but the match once Shamrock started coughing up the blood, which was not the planned point of ending. Vader was still out of action this week with a hyperextended elbow from the Shamrock match in Japan. Bulldog suffered a back injury while training and missed the house shows but was at television, although didn't do anything but walk to the ring and do some run-ins as his match with Dude Love was cancelled with the Kane angle. More than 10,000 tickets have been sold for Survivor Series in Montreal, so it's expected to sell out. There was some heat among fans in Wichita as Shawn Michaels was advertised to be the referee in the triple threat match with Brett, Helmsley, and Undertaker, but no-showed the event. Some fans asked for refunds and were told since he wasn't advertised as a wrestler on the show that it wasn't policy to offer refunds. WWF wrestlers will be leaving this week for a tour of Oman and Bahrain in the Middle East. Bret Hart appears on Fox's Mad TV on November 1st. The Reader's Pages. Fritz von Erich. This morning I went to my video collection and watched the Fritz von Erich vs. Giant Baba match from December 3, 1966. This was the match that was the first sellout at Budokan Hall. After 30 years, it shows von Erich at his best. This prototype of all monster heels kicked like Bruiser Brody, and his Iron Claw, ridiculed by Danny Hodge and misused by pretty boy faces in the 80s, had 16,000 Japanese worrying that their national idol's head would be crushed. Smelling blood, he threw officials and fans around like stacks of old newspapers. What Steve Austin is today, Fritz von Erich did in the 50s. We can criticize his hypocritical personal life and debate his failings as a promoter, but let's not forget that Jack Atkinson was a great pro wrestler. The story of Fritz introducing his three sons at the NWA convention as future world champions sounds ridiculous now, but you have to remember it had already been done and done successfully by Dory Funk. What might have been the difference is that Dory Jr. and Terry grew up with beer and rednecks at Amarillo while the Von Erichs grew up with more sophisticated people and hard drugs in Dallas. I enjoyed the IWF pay-per-view and gave it a thumbs up. The big winners were the pro wrestlers, Frank Shamrock, Matt Hume, and Tsuyoshi Kosaka. Maybe the Brazilians have the greatest fighting style, but who can wait around for 2 hours for a finish? Doesn't it seem like if you've seen one Brazilian fight, you've seen them all? The wrestlers are the best athletes and I love watching them maneuver on the mat, but amateur wrestling style was intentionally made incomplete to avoid injury. Tom Erickson can't think or adjust on the mat, and from watching him against Kosaka and Bustamante, he's a long way from being the best. There is no need for a cage at this event. It was used to restrict movement and as a tool for leverage. A large wrestling mat with 3 circles could be used. The middle circle could be the wrestling area. The area within the second circle would be colored to warn the contestants they are nearing the outer edge. The third circle would be out of bounds, and if any part of the wrestler enter, the ref would have to stop the action, stand them up, and restart in the middle. He could allow them to continue if a finish was at hand or a wrestler was using the rules to force a deliberate break. This would eliminate people laying on the cage with nothing happening and all the bad press and PR that goes with an event held inside a cage. A mat would tell people there is a difference between this and UFC. Another problem is that the event didn't build to anything, but I hope we see more pay-per-view shows like it. Steve Yohei. Montebello, California. Upon reading your excellent autobiography on the late Fritz von Erich, I just thought I'd voice a few thoughts. I was never a fan of the Von Erichs or world-class wrestling because I found the whole thing wasn't what it was made up to be. The Von Erichs exposed themselves in full daylight as soon as they stepped into the ring. I don't mean to knock them, but to me they always lacked believability. How people would go nuts as Kerry would have Ric Flair in a sleeper and the camera zoomed in to show the immense air pockets of the hold is beyond me. Kevin was just plain annoying to watch. I remember a former opponent once telling me Kevin would be stuffed just because he could get away with it. Their opponents also noticeably had to always hold back. You also touched upon Fritz's born-again background. I myself am born again, and to set the record straight, that term isn't an insincere euphemism for a con artist. It denotes a personal relationship with the Creator, Jesus Christ. What Fritz tried to hide from the public was proof positive that, like the book says, you reap what you sow, which is something Fritz should have known. I feel terribly sorry for them, but it sure makes you think. Mike Migelotti. Vilpula, Finland. Once in a while you write a story that should go down in wrestling journalism history as well studied and documented. A prize-winning article. You outdid yourself in the story on Fritz von Erich. These are the articles I have my non-wrestling fans read. I remember watching Fritz when I was 9 years old, and his wrestling matches are still alive in my memory. When World Class used to wrestle in San Antonio in the 80s, they attracted every teeny bopper alive. One match that featured David, originally scheduled for Kerry, against Ric Flair, the upper level was opened at the Hemisphere Arena. This was the only time the upper level had been opened for a wrestling match. It's a shame what happened to this family. We had an almost similar story here in San Antonio, except in boxing. The Ayala father also pushed his sons into boxing from an early age. They had their drug problems and one son is now in prison for rape. I guess the lesson here is not to live your life through your kids. Jesse Reyes. San Antonio, Texas. This is ridiculous. The September 22nd issue spent 4.5 pages on the death of Fritz von Erich. What the hell am I paying for? I can understand a half page, even a page, but 4.5 pages? It's time to speak up. I ignored the issue with a story about some dead roller derby lady. This was the final straw. I get this newsletter because it's the best. I've tried all the others and it's the best. But if you're going to keep this up every time somebody dies, you're going to lose readers. Nobody cares about a lengthy story surrounding a wrestler's death. If we don't already know about their career after they die, isn't the time to start educating us. Simply tell us that the guy died, what names he wrestled under, and a few quick facts about his career. It's hypocritical to go any deeper and not paying for that crap much longer. John Cashmere. Burlington, New Jersey. Your story on the Von Erich family should have been written for a broader audience. Huge kudos for a masterful examination of a tragic family. I sadly shook my head reading about how Fritz rushed Kerry back from the motorcycle accident for 2,200 fans. Death of a Dynasty and Betsy Sherman's Blood Sport are two of the best efforts in wrestling journalism ever. The two pieces peel away the layers of a unique business to display ills that float like ghosts whose ignorance will dig more early graves. Kevin Donlin. Pasadena, Maryland. Anderson. Parts of the NWO spoof on the Four Horsemen were funny, but it simply went too far. If Six wanted to come out and do a funny impression of Ric Flair, that was fine. Conan as Steve McMichael throwing around a football was cool. As for Marcus Bagwell as Kurt Hennig, well, Marcus shouldn't quit his day job. But fun is fun, and that's okay. Kevin Nash's impression of Arn Anderson crossed the line. Arn Anderson's wrestling career was cut short because he was willing to be the worker that Kevin Nash could never be. Nash needs to remember, if it wasn't for Vince McMahon's marketing genius, he'd still be a parody of a real wrestler as another Oz or Master Blaster gimmick. I know there have been problems between the Horsemen and the Wolfpack, and God knows I hate older wrestlers holding back the younger wrestlers, but Arn Anderson spent an entire career literally breaking his neck putting over untalented dopes like Kevin Nash. The skit started out funny, but it ended up as a tasteless segment that seemed like it came right out of Sold Out. Dan Moreland. Limeport, Pennsylvania. Pro wrestling is a strange world. And Nitro is a strange place. Wins and losses really don't mean anything in wrestling because of its nature, yet nobody wants to lose a match to anyone. Wrestlers aren't wanting to do jobs, so we are back to the dusty no-finish booking. In real sports, wins and losses are real. Nobody has a problem knowing that when two teams enter the day, one will lose. College football has started, and you'll hear over and over how one loss can cost you everything, and it usually does. Yet in pro wrestling, one loss won't cost you much. But we still can't get clean finishes, even in the most logical situations. I was genuinely moved by Arn Anderson's retirement interview. I was just as saddened when Kevin Nash tried to destroy it. Nash seems so insecure. His main purpose in wrestling seems to be to kill the heat of whomever he's supposed to be working with. He doesn't care about his wrestling because he's still a slug in the ring, But nobody can make him look bad because above all else, Nash and Hall have to be cool. When Nash retires, could he ever have a genuine moment like the one Anderson had? He never will, so he has to destroy it to lessen the impact. Flair should leave WCW and retire. How much abuse can one legend take? The worst thing about the Wolfpack is that most of their matches suck, but look at how many catchphrases they have. The state of announcing in wrestling is the worst it has ever been, and the worst part about that is nobody seems to even care. Bobby Heenan is just out to lunch. Larry Zbyszko has a presence, but he's totally clueless. Tony Schiavone tries, but he's fighting a losing battle. I don't mind the Nitro girls, as long as they aren't overdone. Kimberly Page seems to be the worst dancer and they hide her in the back. But on Nitro, it's who you know and not what you can do. Paul Nucci. Ypsilanti, Michigan. Is Kevin Nash an idiot? He has the nerve to criticize Ric Flair and Arn Anderson. Even at 48, Flair is a better worker than Nash could ever hope to be. If not for the Four Horsemen, and Flair in particular, WCW wouldn't exist today. Nash, Hall and everyone else would be working for peanuts while the WWF had a monopoly on the wrestling business. McMahon would still be promoting weekly Battle of Juiceheads consisting of nothing but punches and leg drops. Anderson has been a bright light in the wrestling universe. His work in the ring and most importantly on the mic can't be replaced. He stayed as an athlete and a real person during an era of stupid gimmicks and always let his personality speak for him instead of his clothing. It is a tribute to Anderson that today's wrestlers cut from the same cloth like Dean Malenko and Chris Benoit are so over. John Palmer. Sarasota, Florida. I just wanted to write and say thank you for printing Jim Cornette's tirade. It was wonderful having the Wolfpack's warts brought to light in a forum neither they nor Eric Bischoff could control. I could have lived with the NWO's parody if it were done as an angle to build up a feud and eventually lead to the Horsemen getting revenge. Instead we saw Ric Flair's head crushed inside a cage door. My guess is the eventual revenge is Flair will get a DQ win over Michael Wall Street or Scott Norton. What irks me the most is that the skit was a petty attempt to embarrass both Flair and Anderson on a personal level. Anderson did a classic interview that will be remembered for years, and I guess that's something those in charge of the NWO circle jerks can't deal with. I can't decide which I found more amusing, Cornette's remarks or the report that someone bought stock in the USWA on the premise it was worth $2 million. I think we're very close to saying goodbye to the old Memphis circuit. The nostalgic part of me is very sad about it. Make no mistake, the demise of the USWA wasn't caused by the Monday Night Words or the current ownership feud or any other excuses. It was because the promotion, the wrestling and the television have bordered on being unwatchable for close to 3 years. They've had some bright spots, but far more dark spots. After having watched many of Bruno Sammartino's matches on tape, my opinion is that Sammartino has been called overrated so many times he has now become underrated. No, he was not a great scientific wrestler, but he was a good brawler and he knew enough psychology that he could make a go of it without doing topes and planches. I can honestly say I've never seen a bad Sammartino match. Nobody complains about Cactus Jack and Bruiser Brody being subpar technical wrestlers, so why does Sammartino get this heat? John McAdam. Dracut, Massachusetts. Pillman. The issue on the passing of Brian Pillman continues in your tradition of excellent journalism. Thanks to your ability to convey the human side of this bizarre world, I can say I feel I knew about the man and the extent of this latest in a long series of tragedies a little bit better than I otherwise would have, and probably more so than most of the other wrestlers who have had an untimely death. Brian Pillman's struggles with the adversities of life, which he faced unflinchingly, can be admired and respected by us, the fans. Steve Gerber. El Toro, California. ECW. I agree with you about the decision by certain cable companies not to carry UFC and or ECW is both unsettling and scary. Most people are only bothered about censorship when it comes to something they care about. But censorship has always bothered me no matter when or to what it happens. I disagree with you that by fans not chanting what they want or Paul Heyman not presenting the product he wants to that it is not in at least some way selling out. ECW was built on being politically incorrect, vulgar, violent and having some of the most zealous fans. By bowing to outside pressures, they are still selling out, by necessity granted, but still doing so. However, I sympathize greatly with their plight and am at a loss as to what I would do in the same situation. By delivering a watered-down product, in essence they are bowing to the whims of their censors. Why is it that a wrestling newsletter, which many dismiss as not really journalism, recognizes the scariness of this censorship, whereas most of the mainstream more respected publications can't grasp this? And more importantly, how can this be brought to everyone's attention? Not just the readers of the Wrestling Observer? Stephen Muller. La Crosse, Wisconsin. Response from Dave Meltzer: television and cable stations have the absolute right to decide what they want to air on their specific channels. That is not censorship any more than an editor of a newspaper has the right, and in fact the job, to decide what gets into the newspaper. Granted, most cable systems are monopolies in their market, just as most major newspapers are also monopolies in their market. The problem on the ECW and UFC issue is inconsistency. There is nothing on the ECW pay-per-view, which viewers have to go out of their way to buy and see, that is different from their television show that those same cable companies broadcast on their stations, which anyone, including young children, can switch channels and inadvertently see. If the systems have problem with the violence content or the language content and apply that standard to movies on pay-per-view and on broadcast television, that is upholding standards and not censorship. But that isn't the case in these issues. I'd buy the arguments of those not wanting to put ECW on pay-per-view if they would point to specific things about the product that concern them, thus giving ECW the fair chance to eliminate those problems, as they did by dropping the Sandman/Raven/Tyler Fullington angle, or if banning ECW on pay-per-view would be consistent in as far as what makes sense in what they don't allow already not only on pay-per-view but on their broadcast channels. In the case of UFC, it's usually cited as barbaric and dangerous, yet pro boxing, which has a track record of being far more dangerous, not to mention its recent series of fiascos. One event can be an aberration, but 3 big heavyweight fights in a row that were fiascos becomes a track record. In major heavyweight fights, is allowed on free television on networks on Saturday mornings, while UFC is also limited to pay-per-view, where the only people watching are those who are willing to pay to see it. Pay-per-view by its very nature, because people can't stumble upon it, should have far more lenient standards, but I'm not in favor of elimination of standards and don't disagree with cable companies' rights to not air pay-per-view shows as they see fit, just strongly disagree when it comes to both the UFC and ECW products for reasons stated above. For that reason, I consider what has happened with cable companies and these two products to be really scary, because in both cases the economic long-term future of the products are in jeopardy for reasons that in my mind don't make logical sense. When Galavision aired a UFC clone for free on broadcast television and things like bullfighting, which is far more barbaric, airs on broadcast television, and you didn't see politicians or those cable companies that ban UFC from pay-per-view blacking out Galavision during those 2-hour window where viewers that aren't willing to pay for the show could have simply stumbled on it. If a cable company were to ban boxing, WWF, WCW, UFC and ECW from pay-per-view and cite specific reasons, and then due to consistency, not air the broadcast wrestling and boxing television shows and movies and other programming that doesn't fit into similar standards as to why they weren't going to allow it. I disagree with their position, know they'd get incredible heat for their position, but would have a hard time arguing the inconsistency. The logic when it comes to the systems that are currently banning ECW and or UFC escapes me due to the lack of consistency in applying whatever standards they claim to be applying, so it's more a logic issue than a censorship issue. I went to the Raw show at Madison Square Garden and thought it pretty much sucked. I had good seats, but I couldn't see anything because of signs and people standing on chairs. I watched most of the show on the big screen. It was similar to being at the ECW arena in terms of not being able to see what's going on, except that's the ECW arena and this is Madison Square Garden. I realized that the 1990s marks are even stupider and more annoying than the 1970s marks, thanks to the internet. When I watched the show on television later, I thought it was a great show. Some of the letters you've printed about the lack of good wrestling in ECW are ridiculous. Do the names Dean Malenko, Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, Rey Mysterio Jr., Psicosis, Juventud Guerrera, Steve Austin or Too Cold Scorpio mean anything? Or the Michinoku wrestlers? Or Jerry Lynn, Chris Condito, Mikey Whipwreck, Tom Pritchard or PJ Walker? ECW and ECW alone raised the quality of wrestling and booking in television in America to new heights. It's not their fault if their crowd chants boring at every wrestling hold, okay, maybe that is their fault, or that every talented wrestler goes somewhere else after getting over. If you claim to be a wrestling fan and you don't like ECW, you're either an idiot or you take wrestling way too seriously. Dan Weisberg, New York, New York. Wrestling Observer Newsletter. P.O. Box 1228, Campbell, California 95009-1228. October 27, 1997. This is the end of this program. Thanks for watching. See you next time.